A bitter wind howled through the vast, snowbound plains as twilight bled into a frigid winter night. A night when fate would rewrite the lives of two lost souls. In that desolate moment, as icy gusts swept across a remote Wyoming homestead, a solitary knock at a creaking, weathered door shattered the silence like a promise of change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Gideon Ford, a rugged, lonely rancher haunted by memories of loss and isolation, had long relied on the steady rhythm of solitude. His sprawling ranch, nestled amid frost-rimmed canyons and endless fields of sagebrush, was both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where every creak in the floorboard recalled the echo of a faded past. Yet on this night, something stirred beyond simple routine. A notice, a small, faded advertisement, had been posted for a cook, a role that might mend the emptiness of his long-forgotten kitchen. He never truly expected an answer to call upon him like a rescue from loneliness. At the moment a knock resounded, a surge of icy apprehension mingled with inexplicable hope. Gideon's face, lined and weather-beaten from years of frontier hardships, remained impassive as he padded slowly across the creaking wooden porch. His hand, callous from handling leather and iron, grasped the worn latch as he opened the door to reveal a scene that would forever alter his solitary existence. There, beneath the weak glow of an oil lamp and shrouded in layers of threadbare blankets, stood Lana Beaumont, a shivering girl barely in her early 20s, her face pale and eyes wide with both terror and desperate resolve. Clutched tightly against her slender chest was a newborn, swathed in ragged cloth, whose tiny features were barely perceptible amid the cold shadow of the night. The biting wind whipped Lana's dark hair about her face, and frost glittered upon her tear-streaked skin as she trembled, not only from the chill, but from the weight of a past she could no longer escape. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as Gideon regarded the figure before him. He had expected perhaps a cook in need, a practical, unremarkable plea for work, but never had he imagined the raw vulnerability and quiet defiance contained in her gaze. Without a word, the silence that followed dripped like icicles of destiny. Outside, the wind carried the distant mingled sound of cattle lowing and the murmurs of a resting town, while the darkened sky promised further storms. Lana's eyes, dark and resolute, met Gideon's, and in that brief unspoken exchange, both recognized the burden they had borne alone for far too long. She hesitated at the threshold, shivering not merely from the cold but from the terror of being pursued by a past that had chased her relentlessly. Her voice, barely above a whisper, crackled with raw emotion as she said, "Please, I saw your notice. I have nowhere else to go." Her words were fragile, each syllable trembling like the distant sound of a lone banjo in a vast, empty field. Gideon's gaze softened imperceptibly beneath his weathered hat. He had lived among the harsh realities of frontier life, where betrayal's wild tempest and the unyielding silence of loss were commonplace, and he knew well the gravity of a wounded soul in need of sanctuary. In that instant, the call for a cook took on an unexpected guise, as he perceived not a mere laborer, but kindred spirit battered by cruelty and circumstance. "Come in," he said, his tone low and measured, the words carrying a promise of refuge without any unnecessary embellishment. His voice, as steady as the ancient oaks that lined his property, reached Lana like a complicated benediction. "There's warmth here, and work enough to help you mend what's been broken, if you're willing to try." Inside, the homestead was modest, a creaking structure with patched windows fogged from years of winter chill, and a dimly lit parlor where a small oil lamp cast dancing shadows upon worn wooden floors. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a reminder of both survival and the unforgiving nature of life on the frontier. Gideon led Lana to a rough-hewn bench near a battered table, where a few simple tools and utensils lay scattered. Every object in that humble dwelling was imbued with the weight of a hard-won existence and the quiet promise of a fresh start. Lana sat down cautiously, her newborn cradled in one arm. She wrapped her arms around the tiny bundle as if to protect it from the encroaching cold and the ghosts of her past. In that moment, the enormity of her journey was apparent. Fleeing from an abusive partner whose cruelty had left her no choice but to run, and now seeking not just shelter, but the chance to redefine herself in a world that offered both beauty and brutality in equal measure. Gideon watched her with a guarded compassion. He had lost much in his own life, a wife who had faded like summer light, and the simple joys of familial closeness. The cry for a cook had been nothing more than a means to ease his burdens around the ranch. Yet here stood Lana, an embodiment of both fragility and defiance. His eyes, reflecting quiet sorrow and hard-earned resilience, revealed that he, too, longed for a connection beyond the solitude of endless winter nights. As the evening wore on, the wind outside gradually abated, and the homestead settled into a resonant stillness. Over a modest meal prepared in the old cast-iron stove, Lana exchanged few words with Gideon. Instead, their communication was woven through glances, a momentary lifting of her tired gaze as her newborn stirred, a brief nod from him that spoke of shared understanding, and a silent acknowledgement that both carried scars too deep for casual conversation. Their dialogue was sparse, each word measured and deliberate, laden with the unspoken mutual recognition of lives haunted by loss yet buoyed by the possibility of redemption. Outside, the winter night began to yield to a hesitant, pale dawn, the first light breaking over the distant, craggy ridges, illuminating the pristine expanse of snow and sagebrush. The silence was momentarily punctuated by the distant clatter of hooves, a sound that sent a shiver through Lana's already fragile composure. It was a reminder that dangers of the past might still chase her, that the ghosts of her cruel partner and his allies might yet loom on the horizon. Gideon, ever vigilant amid the lingering uncertainty of frontier life, rose slowly from his seat, his eyes darkening with concern. "You must be cautious," he said in a low murmur, his voice nearly drowned by the soft rumble of the approaching day. "The world out there is harsh, and not all who wander aim to heal." His tone carried the weight of regret, and the hard lessons learned in isolation. Lana's hand, stiff with cold and trembling from recent fear, reached up to cover hers momentarily before she withdrew it. In a determined yet fragile voice, she responded, "I've been running for so long that I almost forgot how to stand still. But I won't let them take back what little freedom I have won." Her words, barely audible, spoke of a soul hardened by pain yet open to the healing power of kindness and new beginnings. The moment was charged with possibility, a delicate interplay of sorrow, resistance, and hope that shimmered like fragile glass in the cold light of early morning. Though neither promised an easy future, the unexpected meeting between the lonely rancher and the shivering fugitive had ignited an unspoken pact. In the merging of their solitary lives, there now lay the promise of a shared path, a chance to build something enduring out of the ruins of the past. As the homestead's windows glowed softly against the encroaching cold and the first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, Gideon closed the door behind them with a deliberate finality. Outside, the world was vast and unforgiving. Yet within these humble walls, there was a quiet sanctuary, one where a lonely man and a desperate woman with a newborn might begin to heal, step by hard-fought step. The wind whispered to the pines, carrying both the scent of cold earth and the promise of new beginnings. And as the day began to break over the snowy plains, the subtle sound of distant hooves faded into the echo of hope, a silent omen that fate, though cruel at times, could be gently reshaped by the courage of those willing to embrace their scars and forge ahead. Dawn crept over the snowy plains like a fragile promise as Gideon Ford and Lana Beaumont settled into the modest shelter of his remote Wyoming ranch. In the wake of the solitary knock that had shattered the bitter winter night, a tentative calm now reigned over the homestead. Outside, the distant sound of hooves, faint yet persistent, echoed across the frozen landscape, a reminder of threats lurking beneath the endless white. Inside, however, the ranch's weathered walls and the soft glow of a single oil lamp offer respite from that harsh reality. Gideon, still adjusting to the unexpected arrival of Lana, a young, shivering fugitive with a newborn swaddled in tattered cloth, moved with quiet deliberation through his creaking parlor. Each step on the worn wooden floor seemed to carry echoes of a past filled with mourning and solitude. He carefully set a heavy cast-iron kettle on the stove, coaxing a modest fire to life with the practiced ease of a man well accustomed to frontier hardships. As the gentle heat began to thaw the lingering chill of the long winter night, he stole a glance toward Lana, whose eyes darted anxiously to the window at the sound of each distant hoofbeat. Her grief and guarded hope mingled in those eyes, reflecting a soul hardened by abuse and nurtured, perhaps, by the promise of sanctuary. Outside, the landscape was a study in contrasts. Snow-covered ridges and ice-bound sagebrush stretched to the horizon, while soft pinks and grays heralded the breaking of a new day. The air was crisp with the tang of wood smoke and the faint aroma of cold earth. Every gust of wind that slipped past the ranch's battered walls carried with it a memory of last night's storm and the ceaseless threat of the past. Yet here, in this remnant of home and isolation, a new page had been turned. Gideon approached Lana with a heavy, yet compassionate heart. "You must be hungry," he said simply, his voice low and measured. He held out a tin cup of lukewarm broth, a humble meal that nevertheless had the power to evoke warmth in both body and spirit. Lana's fingers, still cold from the long journey, trembled as she accepted the cup. For a moment, their eyes met. The quiet kindness in his dark gaze and the cautious vulnerability in hers melding with unspoken promises of understanding. Between them, unadorned words were exchanged in glances and small gestures. As Lana settled into a creaking wooden chair near the long table, she pulled her threadbare blanket closer around her shoulders. The blanket, though faded and worn, had a softness that endeared it to her, symbolizing the fragile comfort of a new beginning. She wrapped around herself and her newborn as if to shield them against the unceasing cold and the shadows of her past. As the kettle began to sing softly, Gideon busied himself preparing a simple meal. The rhythmic clatter of his work, the scraping of a cast-iron skillet against a wooden board, the measured stirring of stew, melded with the distant, persistent sound of hoofbeats outside. Every so often he paused and listened, a frown creasing his brow. Though the initial threat had seemed distant, his intuition told him that the world beyond the ranch's walls was not yet at peace. Lana, seated quietly, began to ease into the daily rhythms of the homestead. With tentative movements, she helped set the table with mismatched tin cups and battered plates. In her careful, deliberate actions, there was a sense of reclaiming agency, a small defiance against the chaos from which she fled. As she arranged a bundle of pine boughs as a makeshift centerpiece, her eyes drifted to a small, intricately carved locket left on a side table. It appeared to have been a relic of better times for Gideon, a token of love lost to the ravages of time. In the locket's delicate contours, Lana saw a reflection of her own hidden hope, that even in the depths of desolation, fragments of beauty and memory might guide one toward healing. When the meal was served, silence reigned for a while. Only the soft crackle of the oil lamp and the distant, uncertain murmur of hooves whispered in the background. Over the simple repast, interspersed by measured glances and the occasional nod, the two began forging a bond built on mutual suffering and tentative trust. For Gideon, the memory of a wife long gone still haunted the lonely corridors of his mind. For Lana, the horrors of her flight and the abuse she had endured were burdens she bore in every quiet moment. Yet, in the act of sharing a meal and the steady cadence of domestic routine, something new began to take root. A connection that promised to mend, however slowly, the wounds of their pasts. Outside the window, the day advanced with a hesitant hope. The distant sound of hoofbeats had lessened to a sporadic clatter, but certain signs, a fresh patch of disturbed snow near the ranch, an unfamiliar set of footprints leading toward a frozen creek, spoke of persistent danger. Town gossip had already begun to swirl through the nearby settlement. The few locals who dared to speak in hushed voices at the general store murmured about a fugitive on the run and men with dark intentions following her trail. Such whispers, carried on the crisp wind, made Gideon's eyes narrow with concern. After the meal, while the newborn slept soundly tucked in a corner of a spare room lined with patched quilts, Gideon stepped out onto the porch. The pale morning light revealed a landscape both beautiful and merciless, a world defined by snow-laden valleys, icy creeks, and the low, mournful song of the wind as it swept through the pines. He scanned the horizon with practiced caution, aware that in these parts, safety was a fragile illusion. In the quiet light of dawn, his thoughts turned, unbidden, to the possibility that the persistent echoes of last night's pursuit might be more than mere rumor. They might herald the approach of those who sought to return Lana to the oppressive confines of her past. Inside, Lana sat by the parlor's small window, wrapping her hands around the faded fabric of her shawl. Her gaze was drawn to the vast, snow-covered plains beyond. In that still, sparing moment, fear and longing intertwined. Fear of what might come, and an overwhelming desire to remain free, to carve out a space where she could protect her child and build a future on her own terms. She recalled the quiet resoluteness in Gideon's eyes and a subtle warmth kindled within her heart, a glimpse of redemption, tender but persistent. Later that day, as the homestead's routine began to reassert itself with the repair of frost-cracked boards and the distant hum of village life, an unsettling discovery was made near the rear door. One of the ranch hands found a cluster of freshly disturbed snow prints, accompanied by a small scrap of cloth that matched the color of Lana's tattered dress. The object, fluttering like a lost memory in the cold breeze, was a silent testament that the past was not yet done with her. Gideon's gaze fell upon the fragment as he inspected it with frown etched deep from years of solitude. In that moment, his protective instincts surged anew. He approached Lana, who was busy mending a tear in a set of dish towels with steady, careful hands. With a low, almost imperceptible sigh, he showed her the scrap of cloth. "It appears your pursuers may be following you," he said quietly, his eyes shadowed with worry. His voice, though gentle, carried the gravity of old regrets and the burden of too many lost loves. Lana's heart thudded painfully. For the first time since her flight, the icy specter of her abusive past yawned before her once more. Yet she did not flinch. Instead, a defiant glimmer sparked in her eyes as she folded a scrap of cloth and tucked it inside her threadbare shawl, a symbolic gesture, as if to claim her freedom and protect her fragile future. "I will not be taken back to that life," she whispered, her voice steady despite the quiver of fear. "I choose to remain here, to fight for the life I have begun to build." Gideon nodded, a solemn promise of support in the lines of his weathered face. "We will see this through together," he replied, the modest strength of his words resonating like a vow. For a long, quiet moment, the rancher and the fugitive gazed out upon the snow-slicked plains, where the faint echoes of approaching hooves mixed with a hopeful chorus of the morning birds. The threat remained, a shadow at the edge of their nascent comfort, but it was now something they would face as one. As the day wore on, the homestead slowly stirred to life in measured rhythms. Tasks were undertaken with a renewed sense of urgency. Boards were repaired, the cold creaks of the barn were soothed with fresh oil and small comforts, a freshly brewed cup of weak coffee in tin mug, a shared stew simmered over a crackling hearth, brought brief reprieves from the hardships of frontier existence. In these acts of rebuilding, Gideon and Lana found a tentative sense of unity, a shared understanding that survival was not simply a matter of escaping the past, but constructing a future from its ruins. Yet even as calm returned, the delicate balance was overshadowed by the persistent signs of pursuit. The scrap of cloth and the prints in the snow served as constant reminders that danger was never far away. Lana's eyes frequently drifted to the window, where she would catch fleeting glimpses of dark shapes in the distance moving with purpose. Each sighting stirred memories of abuse and the oppressive chains of her former life, but also fueled her resolve to stand firm in her newfound freedom. In the quiet twilight of the coming evening, as the sun dipped low behind snow-capped ridges and the sky transformed into a canvas of deep purples and bruised pinks, Gideon and Lana shared a moment of reflective silence. Sitting on the rickety porch, they watched as the natural world embraced both the harshness of winter and the promise of renewal. The newborn soft coos from inside and the distant murmurs of a small, resilient community outside offered a counterpoint to the lurking threat from Lana's past. Gideon broke the silence with a gentle, resolute murmur, Perhaps this is our chance to begin anew, not just to escape what was, but to build something far greater. His words were simple and sincere, spoken with the conviction of a man who had wrestled with loss and emerged with fragile hope. Lana's gaze locked with his, and in that silent communion, she understood that her journey, though scarred by darkness, might still lead her toward light. As the evening deepened and the cold settled like a loyal guardian over the homestead, celestial light broke through the gathering clouds. Their future, uncertain and tinged with the possibility of further conflict, now lay before them like an uncharted frontier, a place where each step forward was an act of defiance against fate. But as the final light of day faded into night, a new sound arose, a muffled echo, a determined scratch at the door that spoke of unresolved threat and perhaps of choices yet to be made. With this haunting echo lingering in the crisp air, both Gideon and Lana exchanged one last look. A look heavy with the knowledge that though the night brought a momentary peace, tomorrow might demand even greater courage. And so, beneath a newly calm sky and with a taste of fresh hope mingling with the bitter tang of past sorrows, they prepared to face whatever came next. Their path, carved through the unforgiving Wyoming winter, was far from secure, yet each breath they drew was a defiant declaration of their resolve to live freely and fiercely together. The sound of that persistent scratch at the door echoed in the silent stillness of the ranch as night settled over the snowy plains. Outside, distant hooves clattered on the ice, a rhythm that both threatened and beckoned. Inside, in the dim glow of a single oil lamp, Gideon Ford and Lana Beaumont sat motionless, each lost in their private turmoil. The scratch, deliberate and almost desperate in its insistence, had shattered the fragile piece of their newfound solace, a piece built from shared meals, quiet glances, and the first tentative signs of trust between a solitary rancher and a fugitive seeking refuge with her newborn. Gideon, whose face bore the scars of grief and endurance, reached toward the door with cautious determination. His hand, rough with years of labor, paused above the splintered wood as he exchanged a loaded glance with Lana. The moment spoke volumes, an unspoken agreement that whatever menace lurked beyond this threshold must be faced together. Lana's grip tightened around her threadbare blanket, a prized relic of her past, and she met his eyes. In the silent communion of shared resolve, they both knew that the threat could be tied to the remnants of her dangerous history, a past that had forced her to flee and was still out there, hunting. With measured care, Gideon unlatched the door and opened it just a crack. Beyond the narrow gap, the biting winter air carried a faint, acrid scent of burning would mix with the tang of iron, a smell not entirely unlike that of blood. For a moment, a shadowed face appeared in the frame. A man cloaked in a dark, oil-soaked duster, his expression hidden yet intent. His eyes, when they caught the lamplight, were cold and searching, and his hand rested near something that shimmered faintly, a small engraved pendant, perhaps, or a token whose significance was known only to him. Before Gideon could speak a word, the stranger's gaze swept the threshold and, with an almost imperceptible shrug, receded into the darkness, leaving behind damp footsteps in the margin of the frame. Lana's heart thundered in her chest as she leaned forward, trying to decipher the mystery. "Who was that?" she whispered, voice trembling despite her determined tone. Her eyes, dark with cautious hope, met Gideon's, and the silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Gideon closed the door slowly, his mind churning with questions. "I don't know yet, but it seems our past may be catching up to us," he murmured. He retrieved his well-worn locket, an item that he kept as a memento of his lost wife, and turned it over in his callous hand, as if seeking counsel from its quiet, steady presence. With a measured calm, he set aside and motioned for Lana to join him by the small table. They sat together in the near darkness, the only light a steadied, flickering beacon upon the cold wood. Outside, the wind whispered to the pines and across the snow-dusted ridges, carrying hints of far-off voices and restless movement. In that fragile moment of reprieve, the conversation that followed was sparse yet laden with meaning. "I've been running for so long," Lana said at last, her voice soft yet edged with defiance. "I thought I'd left everything behind, but it appears the past has its own way of finding us. Her eyes, tired yet unyielding, searched Gideon's weathered face, seeking in his steady gaze a promise of protection and understanding. Gideon's voice was low, each word deliberate. This land holds many secrets, some that wish to bind us to our old lives. But here, in the isolation of these frozen plains, we have a chance to break those chains. His hand rested briefly on hers, a gesture imbued with both the warmth of human connection and the unspoken intensity of shared burdens. As they spoke, a sudden sound outside made them both jump. The crunch of fresh snow under heavy, deliberate steps. Gideon rose and walked to the window, peering into the pale light of early dawn. In the distance, beyond the tall pines, he saw clear tracks in the soft earth, hoof prints that led toward the direction of the local town. The quiet evidence spoke of more than just a single intruder. It hinted at a band of pursuers moving with purpose. Their destination was uncertain, but their intent seemed clear. They were coming for Lana. The ache of past torment welled in Lana's eyes as she listened to Gideon's low, resolute words. "They are here," he said, more to himself than to her. His voice was heavy with the weight of experiences he'd lived, of losses that had left indelible marks on his soul. "And I fear they bring with them the ghosts I had hoped would remain buried." Lana looked down at the small, faded letter she had found pinned beneath the remains of the stagecoach, a scrap of paper that now lay nestled within the folds of her blanket. Its words, scrawled hastily in a familiar hand, spoke of old debts and promises unkept. The letter was a remnant of the life from which she had fled, a life of cruelty and confinement, and its presence now stirred a melancholy resolve within her. "I won't allow them to drag me back," she whispered. "I must stand for my child, for myself, for whatever future I can build." Gideon turned from the window, his expression hardening with protective fury. "Then we must move," he declared. His tone was both gentle and commanding, an imperative that brooked no argument. "If they are coming, we cannot linger here where they might find us. We must leave before our trail grows too clear." The decision hung in the air between them like the cold shroud of an impending snowstorm. Lana hesitated, torn between the safety of the known, the dim refuge of the ranch, and the uncertain promise of escape. But as the distant sound of pursuit grew louder, even the trembling of the ground beneath her paws on the worn wooden floor underscored the urgency of the moment. Carefully, she folded the letter into her shawl and rose, the newborn securely swaddled against her chest. In that determined act, she locked away the remnants of her hateful past, a promise to herself that she would forge a path free of its burdens. Gideon swiftly gathered a few essential tools, a hunting knife, a tightly coiled rope, and a dim lantern, and with a curt nod, turned toward the back door. The soft murmur of wind and a faint chorus of distant hoofbeats accompanied their quiet departure. Outside, the winter air was crisp and unforgiving, and the snow around the homestead sparkled like shattered glass on the first tentative rays of dawn. As they tread carefully across the icy ground, their boots crunching softly in the fresh powder, both Gideon and Lana exchanged brief, steady glances, silent assurances that each step forward was an act of defiance against the forces that pursued them. The weight of the letter against Lana's heart, combined with the firm grip of her newborn, lent her a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer felt the crushing despair of the past, but instead the fragile, burgeoning hope of a future forged by her own courage. Their path wound through a narrow trail flanked by snow-dusted pines and rocky outcrops that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Each sound, a gust of cold wind, the soft scuff of boots against hard-packed earth, and the distant call of an eagle, echoed the promise and peril of frontier life. For a moment, as the rising sun painted the sky in hues of red and gold, they paused near a frozen creek to catch their breath. The water, gently murmuring beneath a thin sheet of ice, mirrored the tentative hope in their eyes. In that tranquil pause, Gideon removed his worn locket from beneath his shirt, a small, circular token that had once belonged to his late wife. Its surface, though scratched by time, still bore an inscription that read, "To love, always." He handed it to Lana with a deliberate slowness, his eyes conveying a silent message of trust and solace. "Keep this," he said softly. "Let it remind you that, even in the bleakest moments, there is still light waiting to be found." Lana accepted the locket as if it were a beacon, a talisman against the encroaching shadows of her past. But even as the peaceful moment held the promise of new beginnings, the hush was shattered by a harsh clatter in the distance, a reminder that the pursuers were not far behind. The fresh tracks in the snow grew more distinct, and a cold wind whispered of urgent steps hastening on the trail. Gideon's gaze hardened once more as he shouldered his pack and looked toward the approaching sounds. "They are close," he murmured, voice tight with cautious resolve. Lana's heart pounded with a mix of dread and defiance. "We must hide," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without any further hesitation, Gideon nodded, and they veered off the main trail to a narrow ravine cut deeply into the rocky hillside. The passage was dark and silent, lit only by the feeble glow of their lantern, and it promised temporary sanctuary from the relentless pursuit. As they scrambled down the icy slope, the occasional glance back revealed fleeting shapes on the snow, a flash of dark coats moving swiftly, a brief burst of hose, the echo of a snarled command. The danger was real and unyielding. Yet within the confines of that frozen passage, there was also an undeniable sense of liberation. Lana's mind, clouded by the horrors of the past, now beat with a steady pulse of resolve. Each step was a declaration. She would not be recaptured by the ghost of her old life. Within the depths of the ravine, where the cold air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, their breathing slowed to match the quiet rhythm of survival. Gideon paused and looked at Lana, his eyes the only words needed to say that they would merge together no matter the threat. In that charged silence, her fingers brushed against a locket, and she whispered, "I am no longer defined by what was done to me." Her voice, fragile yet resolute, carried the promise of a brave new beginning, a beginning that was already taking shape in the harsh, unforgiving wilds. The sound of distant pursuit faded for a scant moment, as if the very earth offered them a brief respite. Yet even then, the ominous imprint of fear remained, the knowledge that danger might return at any instant. And so, with hearts still heavy but spirits kindled anew, they pressed on to the shadowed corridor, uncertain of what awaited them at its far end. As the ravine began to widen into a small clearing beneath a sky freshly painted by the dawn, a sudden cacophony of shouts echoed in the distance. A group of men, faces obscured by fur-lined hats and grim expressions, had appeared on a ridge above, their voices carrying over the snow-laden landscape. Their intentions, shrouded in menace and the echo of old vendettas, promised to test the fragile resolve of both Gideon and Lana. Gideon tightened his grip on the locket, now a symbol of hope and defiance, and exchanged a final, steady look with Lana. In that look lay every unspoken promise, to protect, to heal, and afford a future unbound by the cruelty of the past. With the sound of hostile voices now closing in once more, their fate teetered on the edge of a revelation that could either shatter their newfound liberty or propel them toward an uncertain freedom. The shouts from the ridge mingled with the howling wind as Gideon and Lana pressed deeper into the shadowed ravine. For several long, heart-stopping minutes, the pursuers' voices had surged overhead, their angry calls echoing off the icy walls. Then, as if the weight of their threat were momentarily postponed by the relentless winter tempest, quiet settled over the narrow passage. Gideon's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the sweeping vista from their hiding place, a frozen canyon where snow-laden pines bowed in silent submission and the cold, damp earth crunched softly underfoot. Lana's breath, visible in the frigid air, trembled as she clutched her threadbare blanket closer. The weight of the letter she had tucked away, a bitter relic from her past, pressed against her heart, mingling with the rising hope that had sprouted since her arrival at the ranch. The immediate threat had not entirely vanished. Fresh tracks in the muddy snow led toward a broken window of an abandoned cabin on the edge of the ravine. Beneath that window, an indistinct shape could be seen through streaks of frozen rain. Gideon exchanged a guarded glance with Lana. In that silent moment, the danger felt both present and unervingly inevitable, a promise of confrontation that would test their newfound bond. With deliberate care, Gideon rose from the frozen floor, his hand still resting on the well-worn hilt of his knife. He signaled for Lana to follow him toward the derelict structure. Each step was measured, every crunch of snow a reminder of the precarious line between safety and exposure. The abandoned cabin, a relic of a once thriving frontier outpost, stood as a testament to survival against the odds. Its walls, though partly collapsed, offered a labyrinth of shadows and hiding places that might yet shield them from the menacing gaze of their pursuers. Inside, the air was stale and filled with the tang of decay and old wood smoke. Dust motes danced in the narrow shafts of pale morning light that filtered through broken planks. Gideon led Lana cautiously into the darkened interior, where every sound seemed amplified: the creak of a loose beam, the distant drip of melting icicles. At one point, Lana's eyes caught a glimmer among the debris, a small, intricately carved wooden token reminiscent of a talisman. It reminded her of the buffalo bone token from her past, but this new item bore symbols that she did not recognize, perhaps left by someone who, like her, had once sought refuge in these harsh lands. As they crept deeper into the cabin, a sudden movement at the far end made them both freeze. A solitary figure emerged from behind a collapsed wall, a man, his face half obscured by shadow and a tattered scarf pulled low over his brow. His presence seemed both furtive and deliberate, as if he had been waiting for them. For one long, suspended moment, their eyes met. His expression was difficult to read, a blend of caution, empathy, and resolve. "I'm Elias," the stranger said softly, his voice barely a murmur, as if reluctant to disturb the hallowed quiet. "I sense you were in need. I mean no harm." His words hung in the frigid air, offering a strange counterpoint to the threat they had been fleeing. To Gideon, who had seen enough of the relentless cruelty of the frontier, this unexpected ally was as puzzling as he was promising. Lana's instincts warred within her. The bitter taste of her past still clung to her tongue, and the memory of her abusive partner's betrayal stoked an ever-present fear. Yet something in Elias's solemn eyes stirred a cautious hope, a yearning to believe that not all strangers came with ill intent. Gideon, however, maintained his guarded demeanor, his fingers tightening around his knife, ready to defend these vulnerable souls if needed. Elias continued, "The men you fear, they are not mere drifters. They are bounty hunters, remnants of an old feud about debts and dishonor. I have heard their names whispered in town and seen their tracks in the snow. I follow them for my own reasons, perhaps to settle old scores, perhaps to protect what remains of what is honorable on this land." His gaze drifted to the wooden token that Lana clutched, and he allowed himself a brief, thoughtful nod. These tokens, they remind us that even broken lives bear the mark of survival. A heavy silence fell as the three men, Gideon, Elias, and the quietly defiant Lana, considered the gravity of his words. Outside, the wind howled to the pines and the fallen roof of the cabin, as though echoing the clash of past and future destinies. The faint sound of approaching footsteps, different now from the earlier pursuit, suggested that the bounty hunters had not yet given up their chase. Their strategy, however, had changed. Rather than a wild, desperate charge, there was methodical precision in the way their presence lingered near the cabin's broken window. Gideon stepped away from the doorway, his gaze turning back to Lana. His expression softened, the rough lines of his face betraying a tenderness that he rarely allowed to surface. "We must decide quickly," he said in a low tone. "We have shelter now, but our respite may be short-lived." His words carried not only the urgency of survival, but also the unspoken promise to protect her and the tiny cry of hope that had taken root between them. Lana swallowed, the weight of her past now mingling with a glimmer of determination. "I do not wish to run forever," she said quietly, her voice steady yet laced with the tremor of remembered pain. "But I will not return to that life, a life defined by abuse and oppression." Her eyes, resolute and piercing, never left Gideon's, and in that moment there was a silent pact between them, to fight for a freedom hard won, even if it meant facing the very darkness that had once nearly consumed them. Outside the ruined cabin, the distant rhythms of hoofbeats began to echo once more, not as the wild clamor of an unruly chase, but as a measured, foreboding beat. Elias stepped back into the doorway, keeping his features calm while glancing toward the window. "I will stay to watch their approach," he offered, his tone one of resigned duty and uncertain allegiance. "But be warned, their next move may not be as predictable as before." He hesitated for a heartbeat, as if weighing the possible consequences of his interference. "I suspect that their intentions stretch farther than mere recapturing," he added softly. "They may be seeking something or someone." His words, cryptic and loaded with meaning, sent a chill down Lana's spine. Gideon placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his eyes unwavering in their promised protection. "Let us rest and gather strength," he replied, his voice imbued with the steady certainty of a man who had weathered many storms. "At first light, we will move and leave behind this place if need be." His resolve, though tempered by the burdens of grief and relentless frontier life, offered a sanctuary in its own quiet way. Lana nodded silently, clutching her threadbare blanket more tightly around her newborn, whose soft coos mingled with the whisper of the wind outside. In the dim glow of the small oil lamp, behind the worn wallpaper of the dilapidated cabin, the fragile outpost became a sanctuary of muted hopes and uncertain plans. As the minutes stretched into an uneasy night, every creak of the old wood and every gust of wind was a reminder of both the beauty and the brutality of the Wild West. Then, from the deepest shadow of the room, a sound of slow, deliberate knocking echoed once again. It came not from the door, but from beneath the floorboards themselves, as if the very structure of the cabin whispered of hidden secrets. The noise set both Gideon and Lana on edge, and even Elias, who had kept his vigil by the threshold, flinched in silence. Lana's eyes widened, a mix of dread and defiant resolve flickering in their depths. The mysterious knock was soft and rhythmic, a pulse that resonated with the unspoken legacy of her past, a legacy of cruelty and abandonment. Gideon exchanged a long look with Lana, a look that said, "We must uncover this mystery, for it may hold the key to understanding why our pursuers have grown bolder." He rose slowly, his rugged frame silhouetted against the dim light, and moved toward a creaking staircase that led to a lower loft within the cabin. Every step he took seemed to echo in the tense silence, as though drawing him inexorably toward the heart of old truths and new dangers. Lana followed closely, her hand instinctively smoothing over the fabric of her worn shawl, a piece that had once kept her warm on long, lonely nights and now served as a shield against the cold specters of her past. When they reached the bottom, the sound of that mysterious knocking grew strangely rhythmic, pulsing along the creaking floorboards. With a final, determined glance at each other, they prepared to confront whatever might lie hidden in the depths of that old cabin. Dawn broke slowly over the Wyoming plains with the gentle promise of renewal. The harsh night had receded into a fragile calm, and the distant sound of hoofbeats had now faded into mere echoes carried by the chill wind. Inside the abandoned cabin, the mysterious rhythmic knocking beneath the floorboards, its persistent pulse like the heartbeat of a long-forgotten secret, had finally compelled Gideon and Lana to confront it. With determined resolve, they knelt by a sagging beam in a secluded corner of the cabin, where the worn board seemed to whisper of hidden memories. Gideon's weathered hand pushed aside a loose plank, revealing a narrow cavity. Beneath it, wrapped in a faded, oil-stained piece of cloth, was a bundle of papers bound together with fraying string. The air in the recess carried the faint scent of musty paper and damp earth, a stark contrast to the crisp, cold wind outside. Lana's eyes widened as she gingerly retrieved the bundle. The papers, yellow with time, were inscribed with hurried, almost desperate script. One letter, in particular, caught her attention. Its header was addressed to her by name, a name that once belonged to the past she had tried to leave behind. And the contents hinted at old debts, betrayals, and a warning that her pursuers were not merely hired bounty hunters, but had been dispatched by those who wished to reclaim not only her, but the honor of a disgraceful legacy. Gideon observed her closely, his own heart heavy with memories of loss and betrayal. When she looked up, Her gaze was stormy and resolute as she spoke in a soft, trembling tone. This letter, it tells of promises made in darkness. They have not forgotten me. The words, laced with both fear and defiance, resonated in the quiet that had settled around them. For Lana, the letter was a final reminder of the suffocating bonds of her past. The abusive partner who had forced her into a life of running and hiding. Yet now, with the fragile support of Gideon and the symbolism of the wooden token, every word in that letter kindled a spark of rebellion within her. Outside, the cabin's wooden exterior creaked as the wind picked up again, stirring a flurry of powdery snow along the roofline. The distant shapes of men, pursuers still lurking in the frosted shadows, had not yet been silenced. Their intentions, now somehow clearer, were to reclaim Lana back into the prison of her old life, so that her past might serve as a dark testimony to their power. The letter revealed that these men were tied by honor and greed to the legacy her former partner had left behind. Yet within the cold script, there was also a subtle plea for mercy from someone who once cared, and that plea now seemed transformed into a challenge for Lana to rise above condemnation. Gideon took a deep breath and carefully folded the letter before placing it inside a battered leather pouch he kept near his heart. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat and produced a knife with a handle worn smooth by time, a tool as utilitarian as it was symbolic. Its blade caught the weak light of dawn and gleamed briefly, a small beacon of the resolve he gathered not only to protect Lana, but also to shield his own fragile hopes. He laid the knife gently on the wooden floor beside the uncovered bundle, as if marking the moment when the past and the future were set to collide. "Lana," he murmured, his voice quiet yet steadfast. "This letter and what it tells us, of debts and honor, remind me that we stand at a crossroads. We can either allow our past to dictate us, or we choose to define our destiny together." His gaze, tender and resolute, sought hers. For too long, he had wandered these cold lands alone, haunted by the memory of a wife who had been lost to fate and neglect. Now, faced with the fresh and familiar pain of another's cruelty, his decision was clear. He would not let darkness triumph again. Lana's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she clutched the fold in her shawl, a remnant of the sparse protection she now afforded herself. "I refuse to be bound by the chains of memory," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the creak of the cabin's old floorboards. "I will not let them reclaim me as a symbol of their disgrace. I choose to fight for a future where I am my own." Her declaration, soft but thunderous in its conviction, filled a small space with a sense of defiant hope. As if acknowledging her determination, the wind outside softened, and the distant hooves, once cacophony of imminent threat, began to recede slowly, swallowed by the vast expanse of the snow-dusted valley and the burgeoning light of day. Yet the danger was not entirely vanquished. A careful tapping at the cabin's door, and then a quick, imperceptible scuffling sound in the snow, reminded them that the pursuers could reappear at any moment, driven by old loyalties and bitter vendettas. Gideon rose and stepped toward the door, each movement deliberate and imbued with the quiet strength of a man who had weathered too many storms to falter now. He opened the door just a crack, peering out into the pale, wintry light. For a moment, the only sound was the icy murmur of the wind through the barren pines. Then, a solitary figure, a bounty hunter whose features were hardened by life on the frontier, appeared on the threshold, his eyes cold and calculating. The bounty hunter's hand rested on a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he regarded Gideon with an unmistakable intensity. "Your lost soul has a price," the man said in a low rasp, his tone measured yet menacing. "They will not let you forget who you are." His words were addressed as much to Lana as to Gideon, a reminder of the darkness that sought to reclaim her, a darkness forged in the unforgiving ashes of her past. Gideon's grip on the knife tightened. Slowly, he closed the door, extinguishing the brief threat with a steady, silent command. Once the man receded into the distance, his voice a lingering threat carried by the wind, Gideon returned to Lana. His eyes softened as he touched her cheek, and in that tender gesture, all the unsaid promises between them were affirmed, that they would face whatever came together, inside the cabin, As the morning light grew steadily warmer, the injured messenger, whose cryptic warnings had led them to uncover the hidden bundle, stirred once again. With a painful groan, he opened his eyes and, through sagging lids, whispered, "I must go. There's more you need to know about Forbes and the debts that tie you." His voice, weak but urgent, sent a shiver down Lana's spine. The letter in her possession, the one she had tucked away earlier, now seemed not only a document of past grievances, but also a roadmap to a future she might yet choose. Gideon, recognizing the importance of this final message, helped the messenger sit upright and offered him water from a chipped tin cup. The old man's words, though scattered and halting, revealed that Forbes, a name tied to ancient rivalries and bitter debts, had orchestrated a pursuit that had nearly torn their fragile sanctuary apart. The messenger's next sentence, however, came in a raspy whisper laden with regret. "Forgive me, for those who have lost honor cannot be redeemed easily." With that, his eyes closed and he slumped in the corner, leaving behind only the sound of shallow breaths and a lingering, cryptic promise of more to come. In the quiet that followed, Lana clutched a small locket, Gideon's late wife's token, and with renewed resolve she declared softly, "I will no longer be defined by what was. Here, we create something new, a life of our own, free and unburdened." Her voice, echoing through the dim cabin, was met with a nod from Gideon, a silent commitment reflected in his steady gaze. This shared moment, mixing anger, healing, and hope, bound them closer together, their paths melding into a single, unyielding determination for a better future. The morning advanced slowly as they prepared to leave the temporary hideout. With sparse, deliberate movements, Gideon gathered his essential tools, a battered knife, a coil of rope, and Lana wrapped their few treasured items tightly in the threadbare blanket. The atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge that while the immediate threat had been repelled, the legacy of her past and the specter of Forbes were not yet fully erased. Still, for the first time in a long while, the thought of choosing one's own destiny filled them with cautious optimism. Stepping out into the crisp, dawn-lit air, they found that the snow had softened under the gentle touch of the rising sun. In the distance, the tundra spread out like an endless promise, its icy expanse decorated with a subtle glow of morning. The pursuers' tracks had faded, and even the bounty hunter's threat now seemed to echo away with the night. Yet, as they began to make their way toward Gideon's main ranch, a place that represented both sanctuary and the chance to rebuild their lives, there remained an undeniable tension, a lingering question of what challenges might yet rise from the embers of the dark past. Gideon and Lana walked side by side along a narrow, snow-crusted trail lined with leaning pines. The newborn soft coos from a carrier wrapped between Lana's arms provided a reassuring counterpoint to the heavier memories they carried. Occasional glances between them spoke of unspoken thoughts, a mutual vow that, regardless of what darkness might try to reclaim them, they would persevere. At the edge of the trail, amid the gently rolling hills and over a narrow frozen stream, Gideon paused and turned to Lana. In his quiet, time-worn voice, he said, "Our journey is but beginning, though our paths cast long shadows. Together we will step into the light." Lana's eyes shone with resolute determination as she nodded, clutching the locket as if it were a sacred relic of her rebirth. In that poignant moment, where the cold air held both the promise of liberation and the memory of old wounds, they moved forward with hearts heavy yet unburdened by despair. Their path, etched in the frost of the Wyoming plains, was uncertain, but every step they took was an act of rebellion against a lifetime of oppression. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in hues of hope and fire, the vast wilderness unfurled before them, a land of endless possibility and quiet challenge. In the distance, faint silhouettes of figures lingered, casting uncertain shadows upon the snow. But for now, Gideon and Lana pressed onward, united in their resolve to build a future free from the chains of the past. With the promise of a new beginning shimmering on the horizon, their journey continued into the open expanse, a testament to the redemptive power of resilience, trust, and an unyielding will to choose one's own destiny.